And we're back.
Perfect. So now we'll move on to some accommodations that may not apply in a virtual environment. So as we were discussing, some examples include the type of exam room, for example, isolation, test room with anxiety, or plain desk room that was already mentioned. Now this wouldn't really matter right now, as students will be writing at home, probably at their kitchen table, in bed, in their pajamas, or somewhere along those lines. But like we were mentioning, it is still on their accommodation letter. Preferential seating also is an accommodation that doesn't apply in the virtual environment, as all students are sitting in front of their computer. And the use of a computer, tablet, or mobile device for class use. This is one that's a given in the remote environment for students to use. Next slide. Required accommodations, but accessible to all. So these are accommodations that are required, but students would have access to them in the virtual environment. For example, the use of a computer with WordPad or grammar and spell check. All students, given that they are writing from home, could have access to these accommodations. The use of a basic calculator. Any student could have a basic calculator sitting next to their computer. The use of a memory aid, as all students would be able to have a memory aid sitting next to their computer. And listen to a commercially recorded CD, as all students would be able to do this as well. Accommodations that can be modified for the virtual learning environment. Adjustment to the attendance policy. Now this could apply to synchronous classes, but not to asynchronous classes. Alternatives to group work. This student could include typing notes or doing research. So when you're doing group work, everyone typically has a role, and the student could be the person in the background that types the notes or does research. Does everyone necessarily have to be the person who speaks during the presentation? Or they could complete the assignment alone or do an alternative paper or assignment. Alternatives to presentation. This could be a one-on-one presentation with the faculty member, a pre-recorded presentation, an alternative paper or assignment. And assignment extensions. Faculty and student can discuss reasonable extension parameters in advance of the deadline. So for example, when students have this accommodation, it would be one where it's important to have that conversation about logistics at the beginning. So if you require an extension on your assignment, I request that you ask me at least 72 hours in advance of the deadline, and then you will get an extra 72 hours after the deadline to complete that assignment. Discuss that with the student and have it set up in advance. And asking for an extension after the deadline is not a reasonable accommodation. And the whole point of adaptations that can be made to these accommodations, it's about assessing the student's learning and making sure that they're learning the information that's required. But why does it have to be specifically in a presentation? Or why does it have to be specifically group work? There are many ways students can participate, so it's coming up with alternatives and trying to be creative with some of that stuff. And if you need support or ideas on how to do that, have a conversation with the student's access advisor. Say, well, they're supposed to do a group presentation. How can we work around that? Or what are alternatives that we can work with? And we're more than happy to work with faculty for that. Next question, or next slide.
And this is where I come in. So we're talking about recording as an accommodation. The options for recording in a virtual environment: universal design, which is where the faculty records lectures and makes recordings available to all students. The faculty can record the lectures and email the student a copy, or students can use their own personal recording device. And I think that's something, Catherine had brought that up. Can I assume that students will be using their own technology? So if you have decided as a faculty that you're not going to use universal design and record all of your lectures, then it is important to work with the student to figure out what's best for them. So we do recommend that students use their own technology, because sometimes, as we know, as faculty, we're recording something and it doesn't work. So we always tell students, have your backup plan ready. So most of them will have their own ability to record. Then students if students will be assessed on the material and other students are taking written notes, then students with recording accommodations should be able to record. When using universal design, the Mount Royal Legal Department and the Copyright Advisor recommend that a recording statement is placed in the course outline. And that recording statement is kind of too late now, I guess, because most outlines are already written out, but that is available in a document that we have. So it should have been sent out by deans, but we never really know who all gets stuff that is sent out. But you can certainly contact one of us and we can send you that blurb to add into your course outlines. Next slide, please. When recording is an accommodation for a student, other students should not be made aware of this. And unless all students have the option to record, so that means that you're just saying to everybody, if you want to record, great, or I am also recording this, but indicating that the class is being recorded by a particular student, even if no names are provided, would be breaking that student's confidentiality. So it is important that if a student is recording for their accommodation reasons, even if they're recording at home, you cannot tell the class that somebody's recording this for accommodations. And also be aware that when we're talking with students, we're telling them that they need to pause the recording when confidential information is disclosed. And keep this in mind as a faculty member. If a student is told to stop recording during their class conversations, other students should also be told to stop writing. And when I first worked here, that really kind of blew my mind. Well, if you're not allowed to record, then why would you tell students to put down their pens? Well, because students can record information in writing, like, oh, Johnny said this, and that's breaking their confidentiality, and I'm able to write that down. So if I can write it down and somebody's told not to record, I should also not be able to record using my pen. And there is an image here of just a little microphone. And next slide. So now we're moving on to course notes and PowerPoints in advance. So the options for the virtual environment are using universal design would mean that you're posting your PowerPoints online for all students prior to their class. Or you could, if you're not using universal design and one of your students has an accommodation for notes ahead, just email the student the copy of those notes prior to the class. Students wishing to have accommodations must sign an accommodation agreement, which states that students agree that the notes and recordings are used for their own use only. They will not share or distribute notes or recordings, and they must destroy notes and recordings when no longer needed, and failure to do so can be considered academic misconduct. Now, I do want to also clarify the whole idea about notes ahead of time. We always tell students that you need to talk with your faculty about how the accommodations fit with the design of the course. Now, there's many professors who don't use PowerPoints at all. They just go in and start talking. We can't force them to create something that didn't normally exist. The other thing that I've come across quite frequently in the last couple of weeks, and I think because we're moving to this online environment and faculty are so busy, they may not have their PowerPoint ready prior to the class. So some of them are telling me, I'm just finishing it up like 10 minutes before the class starts. Well, if that's your reality, we can't force you to send it to that student ahead of time. Like, so then maybe you can tell the student, due to my scheduling, I don't have the PowerPoints ahead of time, but I will email them to you after the class. And that's that power of that conversation between you and the student. So you're both clear about what is going to happen. Andrea, were you going to say something there?
Oh, I'm noting that the next slide will be questions. And so I wanted to be ready to pop in. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Next slide. And this is a perfect time for questions.
I did want to address one thing that came up though, which is sort of this idea of, thinking about alternatives for assessment. So for instance, when Juliana said, does it have to be a presentation? And what folks in accessibility services say is very consistent with what we say in the ADC, which is, what are the goals? Ask yourself, what are the goals for learning that I have for students? Because that will allow you to think about what alternatives for assessment might exist. What is it you actually want them to be able to do? And if, one of the goals for their learning doesn't happen to be speaking aloud in front of a large group of people, then perhaps a presentation isn't the mandatory form in which they can demonstrate their learning. So that's a really key piece, is identifying really carefully for yourself what it is you want students to be able to do. And now I'm going to hit the pause on the recording, stop the recording, so we can go into some in-depth Q&A.